The inventory listed everything: the silver, the linens, the wine cellar, which held 43 bottles of something from Burgundy that no one in the house had touched in 6 years, the east pasture, the stables, the library, contents included, and then, near the bottom of the second page, in the same dry hand as everything above it, one dependent, status uncertain, currently residing in the servants' quarters. Sylvester Dowe read the line. Then he read it again. He set the papers down on the desk that was now, apparently, his desk, in the study that was now, apparently, his study, and looked out the window at the grounds he had purchased 3 weeks ago without ever having set foot on them. The solicitor in Edinburgh had assured him it was a sound investment. The house was in good repair. The land was productive. The previous Earl had died without a direct male heir, and the estate had passed through a series of unfortunate legal arrangements that had resulted, eventually, in it being sold at auction to a man who had not expected to buy it. Status uncertain, the document said. Sylvester Dowe was not accustomed to uncertainty in his inventories. She had been in the house for so long that she had stopped counting the years by calendar and started counting them by the roses. The roses along the south wall bloomed in June. They had done so every June since Beatrix Tolland could remember, which meant they had done so since before she was 10 years old, which meant they had done so for longer than almost anything else in her life had been constant. Her father's health, her father's mood, the number of staff, the understanding of her own position in the household, all of these had shifted and contracted and changed beyond recognition. But the roses came back. Every year, without fail, she was dead-heading them on the afternoon the new owner arrived. She heard the carriage before she saw it. The gravel drive was long, and the oaks on either side of it had grown thick enough over the decades that you could not see the road from the south garden until you were nearly at the house. She heard the wheels first, and then the horses. And then she heard nothing for a moment because she had simply stopped moving. She had known he was coming. Of course she had. Mrs. Drumbar, who had been housekeeper here for longer than Beatrix had been alive, had told the remaining staff 3 days prior. The new owner arrives Thursday. We are to make the house presentable. We are to be courteous and efficient, and to answer whatever questions are put to us. Mrs. Drumbar had delivered this information in the tone she used for everything: level, uninflected, slightly challenging, as if she expected someone to argue with her and was prepared to be disappointed when they did not. Beatrix had not argued. She had instead retreated to the south garden with her basket and her pruning shears, and she had been working there ever since, moving along the wall in a slow, meditative progression that had nothing to do with gardening, and everything to do with not having to think about what came next. What came next was standing in the drive now. She heard the carriage door open. She did not turn around. She was wearing her plain dress, the brown one, the one she wore for work in the garden. Her hair was pinned back simply. She had dirt on her hands and probably on her face, and she looked. She was reasonably certain, like exactly what she appeared to be, someone who worked here. This was, she had decided, the safest thing to be. The footsteps on the gravel came closer, then stopped. "I beg your pardon," a man's voice said. She turned. He was younger than she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Some image assembled from her father's creditors and solicitors, and the men in good coats who had come and gone over the last 2 years, men who were older and softer, and carried their authority like something they'd inherited along with their furniture. This man was not that. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more, with a directness in his expression that she found, in that first moment, slightly alarming. He was looking at her the way people looked at things they were trying to categorize. "You work in the gardens?" he said. She kept her expression neutral. "Yes. How long have you been employed here?" She chose her words with the care she'd had 6 years to develop. I've been here most of my life." He looked at her for a moment, longer than was strictly comfortable. Then he said, "I see," in a tone that suggested he did not quite, and turned back toward the house. His name, Mrs. Drumbar informed the staff that evening, was Sylvester Dowe. He was not a lord, a fact that had apparently required some clarification during his initial meeting with the solicitor who had managed the sale, but he was wealthy enough that the distinction seemed, in practical terms, to matter very little. He had made his money in shipping and in several other enterprises that Mrs. Drumbar described with a vagueness that indicated she did not entirely understand them. He was not married. He had no children. He had, according to the solicitor, purchased the estate on what seemed to be an impulse that even he had not fully explained. Beatrix Wyse listened to all of this from her usual place at the end of the servants' table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she was not drinking. "He'll want to see the staff accounts in the morning," Mrs. Drumbar continued, "and he's asked about the current residents of the house." There was a brief, particular silence. "Residents?" said Clement, who managed the stable, and who had the particular gift of asking questions that everyone else was carefully not asking. "He found a reference in the inventory document," Mrs. Drumbar said. She did not look at Beatrix. She had the discipline not to. "He'll want it explained." Beatrix set down her cup. "I'll explain it." "You don't have to. I will explain it," Beatrix said. "It's fine." It was not precisely fine, but it was necessary, and she had learned a long time ago that the two were often the same thing. She had come back to Tolland House 2 years ago, in January, in the middle of a storm that had turned the road from the village into something more like a riverbed than a path. She had walked the last 3 miles because the carriage had lost a wheel, and she had arrived at the servants' entrance at nearly midnight, soaked through, with a bag that held everything she owned and a letter in her coat pocket that explained nothing and changed everything. Her father had written it 6 weeks before he died, when he had apparently decided that some form of honesty was, finally, owed to her. "My dear girl," it began, which was already unusual. Her father had not been a man of easy affection. He had written, in his careful, cramped hand, that her mother had not been the woman Beatrix had been told her mother was. Her mother had been a woman of no particular family or standing, whom he had loved without any intention of doing so, and without any ability to make it right after the fact, because by the time he had understood that he loved her, she was already gone back to her own people, her own life, a life that had no room in it for an Earl who could not quite bring himself to do the necessary thing. And so Beatrix had been sent away, educated, kept, in a manner of speaking, at a safe distance from the main house for most of her childhood, in a cottage on the eastern edge of the property, with a succession of nurses and governesses who had all understood, without being told directly, that their charge was not to be brought into society. Her father had loved her, the letter said. He wanted her to know that. He had also, the letter said, sold the estate 8 months before his death to clear a debt that had finally grown too large to manage in any other way. The house would pass to a new owner. There was nothing left to leave her. Her name did not appear in the official record of his heirs, because legally she had no standing to appear there. What he could give her, he wrote, was the truth of who she was, and his blessing, and the hope that someone, someday, would look at her and see what he had always seen. He had signed it your father, which was also unusual, because she had spent most of her life calling him by his title in her head, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She had read the letter twice, standing in the wet entrance hall, with water dripping from her coat onto the flagstones, and then she had folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, and she had asked Mrs. Drumbar, who had been awake, who had somehow always been awake, if she might stay, just for a little while, just until she understood what her situation was. Mrs. Drumbar had looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then she had said, "There's a room in the east wing that's not being used. It's cold and the chimney smokes. I expect you'll manage." Beatrix had managed. She had been managing ever since. She requested a meeting with Sylvester Dowe the following morning, and he received her in the study, standing behind the desk with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out the window at the drive in a way that suggested he was still in the process of orienting himself to the house. She came in and stood near the door, which was not where she would have stood. Once she would have come to this room as a daughter of the house, however unofficial. And she would have sat down without waiting to be asked, and she would have spoken first. She had unlearned most of those habits over the last 2 years. They had not served her well. "Miss," he paused. "I'm sorry, I don't have your name." "Beatrix," she said. Then, because he was waiting, "Tolland." Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, exactly. Something more careful than that. He had, she supposed, read the deed of sale. He would have seen the name there. "Tolland," he repeated. "My father was the previous owner," she said. "The late Earl." She kept her voice even, which was something she had also had to practice. "I am not his legitimate heir. I am not, legally, anyone's heir. I have no claim on the property, and I want to be clear about that first, so that there's no confusion about why I'm here." He was looking at her very carefully now. "Why are you here?" he said. "Because I had nowhere else to go," she said, "and because Mrs. Drumbar allowed it." She paused. "I've been earning my keep, in the gardens, and in the library. I've been cataloging the collection. I haven't touched anything that wasn't mine to touch. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. I only ask that you give me a reasonable amount of time to make arrangements." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long have you been living here?" 2 years in the servants' quarters." "Yes, because you had nowhere else to go." "Yes." He was quiet again. She had expected something else. She was not sure what. Questions, perhaps, or a straightforward instruction to pack her things. What she had not expected was the quality of his attention, which was not dismissive and not comfortable, and was, in some way she couldn't quite name, the most unnerving thing about him. "Sit down," he said finally. She sat. He came around from behind the desk and took the chair across from her, which was not what employers did, in her experience. Not with people they had categorized as dependents. "Tell me about the library," he said. The library was Beatrix's true inheritance. It had been assembled, over about 150 years, by a succession of Tolland men who had varied enormously in their taste and judgment, but had all shared, in some form, the belief that a house without a good library was a house not worth the upkeep. There were agricultural volumes and philosophical treatises and 3 shelves of French novels that someone had evidently acquired in a single enthusiastic purchase and then never read. There were maps, very good maps, some of them, and botanical illustrations from the previous century, hand-colored and fragile now, in a way they had not been when they were new. There were letters, catalogued in the wrong order, by someone who had not understood the system, and diaries that had never been intended as anything other than private. Beatrix had been working through the collection methodically, in the evenings, after the work of the day was finished. She had created a proper index. She had separated the fragile items and wrapped them. She had repaired, carefully, 3 bindings that had begun to separate, using techniques she had read about in a volume on the conservation of documents that she had found, appropriately enough, in the collection itself. She told him all of this in the measured, careful way she had learned to speak. Not performing competence exactly, but not concealing it either. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked several questions that told her, immediately, that he was not an ignorant man about books, which she had not expected, and which she found herself adjusting to without entirely meaning to. "The maps," he said. The ones from the survey of the northern property line, are they accurate? Do you know? The solicitor's description of the boundaries didn't quite match what I could see when I walked the east field yesterday. The survey from 1784 is accurate, she said. The one from 1801 has an error in the northeast corner. My father knew about it. He meant to have it corrected and didn't. You knew that, yes. You know this property, he said. Not quite a question. I grew up on it, she said. Not in the house, mostly, but on the grounds. He looked at her steadily. You understand that your situation here is irregular. I understand it better than you do, she said, and then stopped, because that was not the voice she was supposed to be using. He didn't seem offended. I don't doubt it, he said. He did not ask her to leave. This was not, she told herself, anything to read into. He was a practical man, and she was useful. She knew the house. She knew the land. She had nearly finished the library catalog, and it would have been foolish to discharge her before the work was done. That was all. She was useful in the way that a good pair of boots was useful, and no one was sentimental about boots. She continued her work. She continued sleeping in the east wing room that had the smoking chimney, which she had learned to manage by wedging a particular stone against the damper at a particular angle. She continued having her meals in the kitchen with the rest of the staff. And she continued, in the evenings, going to the library, where the work was easier to think about than the alternative. The alternative was the question she had been carrying since January, 2 years ago, which was, what do I do now? She had not been raised for anything in particular. The education her father had given her was thorough and genuine and almost entirely useless for the purposes of earning an income in the conventional sense. She could read Latin. She could speak reasonable French. She could identify most of the birds in the county and name the principal peaks of the Scottish Highlands, and discuss the economic theories of the previous century, with a fluency that surprised people when they discovered it. None of this was a career. None of this was, in the language of the world she lived in, anything at all. She had considered, in the months immediately after her father's death, going to a cousin of her mother's who lived in the Maritimes, and who had written once, years ago, offering a vague welcome that might or might not have still been open. She had considered presenting herself to the solicitor in Edinburgh and demanding some kind of formal accounting of what her father had left. But the letter had been clear, and the solicitor had been polite and firm and entirely unhelpful, and she had come away from that meeting understanding that legal standing was not something she could manufacture out of force of will. And so she had come back to the house, because it was the only place she knew, because the roses were there, because Mrs. Drumbar had offered her a cold room with a smoking chimney and the implicit understanding that she was not entirely alone. She had not considered, not once in 2 years, that the new owner would be someone worth considering. Sylvester Dowe had not bought the estate on an impulse. Exactly. Though he understood why the solicitor had described it that way. The truth was more complicated and less flattering, which was often how true things went. He had been looking for something to do with the money. This was not a problem that attracted sympathy, he knew. But it was real. He had spent 15 years building something from almost nothing, learning the shipping trade from the dock up, making decisions that had occasionally been wrong and mostly been right, accumulating resources at a pace that had felt, in the early years, nearly impossible, and that now felt, sometime, slightly beside the point. He was 32 years old. He had a house in Edinburgh that was well appointed and somewhat cold. He had no family to speak of, a sister in Halifax who wrote occasionally and warmly, and whom he saw perhaps once a year. He had friends and colleagues and people who wanted things from him, which was not the same as people who knew him. He had looked at the estate in the catalog and thought, that's a real thing, land, and a house and history and the kind of rooted permanence that he had never had and had always, in some part of himself he did not often examine, wanted. He had not expected the inventory to include a person. He had not expected that person to walk into his study and explain herself with a dignity that was entirely unaffected and entirely at odds with the position she was claiming to occupy. He found himself thinking about her at inconvenient moments. While going over the accounts, while walking the east field to check the boundary markers, while lying awake in the room that had been some previous Tolland's, and before that, some other previous Tolland's, listening to the silence of a house that had been holding its breath for 2 years. He thought about what she had said. "I understand it better than you do." She did. He knew that. She understood the house and the land and the library and the history in a way that he could not replicate through ownership alone. She had grown up here, in the complicated, unacknowledged way she had grown up here, and all of that knowledge lived in her as naturally as breathing. He had not bought a person when he bought the estate, but he had, apparently, bought a house that contained one, and he was beginning to understand that the two things were not as separable as the inventory had suggested. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the form of a man named Harwick Crane, who appeared in the drive on a Tuesday in September in a very new carriage with a solicitor of his own. Beatrix saw them from the library window and felt something go quiet in her chest. The particular quietness of a thing you have been dreading for long enough that when it finally arrives, the dread has worn through to something more like resignation. Harwick Crane was her father's cousin's son. She had met him twice, both times briefly, and had formed the impression both times that he was a man who experienced the existence of other people primarily as an inconvenience. He had been disinherited from the family's secondary property years ago, under circumstances that her father had never fully explained, and he had contested that decision in a quiet, persistent way that had occupied various solicitors for several years without achieving anything useful for anyone. He had come, she suspected, to contest the sale. She found out from Mrs. Drumbar that same evening that she was right, and also that she had underestimated the scope of it. Harwick Crane had not come merely to contest the sale. He had come with papers prepared by his solicitor, suggesting that the estate had not been the previous Earl's to sell in the first place, because there was a clause in the original entail from 1819 that restricted transfer of the property under certain conditions. "And he's also," Mrs. Drumbar said with the particular flatness she used when she disapproved of something strongly and had decided not to say so directly, "asking questions about you." Beatrix looked up. "About Ma, about who's living in the house, about the inventory entry." Mrs. Drumbar's expression did not change. "I think he's looking for leverage." "He won't find any," Beatrix said. "I have nothing. I've said so myself." "You have a name," Mrs. Drumbar said quietly, "and you have the letter." Beatrix had not told many people about the letter. She had told Mrs. Drumbar on that first January night because it had seemed necessary. She had not told anyone else. She had certainly not told Sylvester Dowe. He came to the library that evening. She was where she usually was in the evenings, at the long table with the catalog spread before her and a lamp pulled close. She heard the door and did not look up because she had learned to do the accounting work of the shelves without lifting her head, and habit was hard to break. "There's something you haven't told me," he said. She looked up then. He was not angry. She had been bracing for something like anger, accusation, or the cool withdrawal of a man who felt he had been misled. What she saw instead was something more like careful attention, the same quality she had noticed in the study on his first day, turned toward her now with a steadiness that she found, as she had found then, unexpectedly difficult to look away from. She said, "There's a letter." "From your father?" "Yes." She paused. "How did you know?" "I didn't," he said. I assumed. You have a face that knows things it isn't telling." She found that she had no response to this. He came and sat across from her at the table, not behind her, not above her, across from her, as he had done in the study that first morning, and as he had continued to do in every conversation since, which she had noticed without fully acknowledging that she was noticing. "Tell me," he said. She told him. It took longer than she expected. She had never told it in full before, not to anyone, not even to Mrs. Drumbar, who had received only the essential facts on that January night. Telling it now, in the library, with the lamp between them and the window dark with September, she found that there were things she had not said aloud before that were harder to say than she had anticipated. Not the facts. The facts were manageable, but the other things, the years of understanding, without being told directly, that she was not quite a daughter. The education that had been given to her as a kind of substitute for belonging. The strange, suspended quality of the last 2 years, in which she had lived in the house without being of it, present without being acknowledged, visible to the people who had always known her, and invisible to anyone who had not. She stopped. She had said more than she had meant to. He was very still. "The letter," he said quietly. "Your father wrote that he recognized you as his daughter." "He wrote that he acknowledged the truth of it," she said. "That's different from legal recognition." "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "In the ways that matter for the purposes of what Harwick Crane is trying to do, yes, it is." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Can I read it?" She had the letter with her. She always had the letter with her, in the inside pocket of whatever she was wearing, because she had found, in the first weeks after her father's death, that she could not sleep properly if it was not within reach. It was not rational. She knew it was not rational. It was the only thing of him she had, and it was, in a way she could not quite articulate, the only proof she had that any of this was real. She took it out and set it on the table between them. He read it slowly, which she had expected. He read it twice, which she had also expected, because she had read it that way herself more times than she could count. When he set it down, his expression had changed. Not dramatically, not with any of the outward signs that she had learned to read in men who were deciding how to use what they'd been given. It had changed in the quieter way of a man who had understood something that made some other things make more sense. "He called himself your father," Sylvester said. "At the end, yes. That matters," he said. He slid the letter back across the table to her. "Not legally. You're right about that, but it matters." She put the letter back in her pocket without answering, because she was not sure she could answer without her voice doing something she would find mortifying in retrospect. Harwick Crane's solicitor came back twice more before October. The entail argument was, as it turned out, not as strong as Harwick Crane had apparently believed. The clause in question had been superseded by a subsequent legal arrangement from 1847, and Sylvester's solicitor, brought down from Edinburgh at some expense and with a satisfying degree of thoroughness, dispatched it within a fortnight. The questions about Beatrix did not go away as quickly. Harwick Crane had in the meantime made some inquiries. He had spoken to people in the village. He had spoken, apparently, to one of the former staff members who had left after the estate was sold, and he had assembled from these conversations a picture of Beatrix Tolland's situation that was accurate in its facts and tendentious in its interpretation. A woman of uncertain parentage, occupying a house she had no right to, in an arrangement that was, at best, irregular, and that, if examined closely, might constitute something that reflected badly on the new owner's judgment. This was not said directly. It was suggested, in the way that such things were suggested, through the solicitor's careful phrasing and Harwick Crane's expression when he looked at her on the one occasion their paths crossed in the entry hall. Beatrix looked back at him without flinching, which was, she felt, the minimum standard she could hold herself to. She will be gone by winter. Harwick Crane told the solicitor, loud enough to be heard. These arrangements never last. Sylvester Dowe did not, as it happened, ask her to leave. What he did instead was considerably more unexpected. He came to the library on a Thursday evening in late October, when the light through the windows had gone the amber color it got in autumn, and the smell of the house had shifted into the particular combination of wood smoke and cold stone that she had known all her life. She heard him come in and waited for the sound of the chair across from her. He did not sit. He stood near the window instead, looking out at the south garden, which was bare now, the roses cut back for the season. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the letter. You don't need to." "I've been thinking," he said again, steadily, "about what it means that your father wrote it, not legally. You've explained the legal position, and I understand it. But he sat down, sometime in the months before he died, and he wrote out who you were and what you were to him, and he sent it to you." He paused. "That's not nothing." She said nothing. "He couldn't give you the house," Sylvester said. "He'd already sold it. He couldn't give you a name in the legal record. He didn't have that to give. But he gave you the truth of it, and he signed it, and he called himself your father." Another pause. "That seems to me like a man who was trying, in the only way he had left, to make it right." She had thought this herself. She had thought it many times. It was different to hear it said aloud by someone who had no stake in it and no reason to frame it as anything other than what it was. "What are you trying to tell me?" she said. He turned from the window. "I've spoken to my solicitor," he said. "There's a mechanism. It's old, and it's rarely used, and he was skeptical when I raised it, but he looked into it, and it's valid. A formal declaration of recognition. It's not the same as legitimate inheritance. It doesn't restore what your father sold, and it doesn't give you claim to this house. But it creates a record, a formal, legal record, that your father acknowledged you as his daughter." He stopped. "It would mean that Harwick Crane can't suggest to anyone that you are here under false pretenses. You're not a dependent of uncertain status. You're a daughter of the house, and this house's history is yours as much as it is anyone's." She was aware of something happening in her chest that she did not have an immediate name for. She had kept things very tightly organized inside herself for 2 years, because loosely organized things were dangerous when the ground kept shifting, and she had needed to be able to move quickly, in whatever direction circumstances required. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do that?" He looked at her steadily. "Because it's right." "That's not a sufficient answer," she said. "People don't incur legal costs and solicitors' fees because something is right." "Some people do," he said. "What do you want from this?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Nothing you haven't already given. You know this house better than I will in 10 years. You've cataloged the library. You've walked every field boundary. You know where the survey from 1801 is wrong, and why. You've been keeping this place alive for 2 years without title or credit or—" He stopped. "You've been invisible here, and you shouldn't have been. That's what I want to change." She looked at him for a long time. "You understand," she said, "that if you do this, Harwick Crane will say that you've done it to gain something." "Let him," Sylvester said. "He'll say that I know what he'll say," Sylvester said. "I don't care what he says." She had met men who said that before. It had not usually been true, but he was looking at her in the steady, direct way he had, the way she had been quietly reorganizing her understanding of since September, and she found that she believed him. The declaration was registered in December, 3 days before Christmas, in Edinburgh, in a proceeding that took less than an hour, and was attended by Sylvester's solicitor, her own new solicitor, also Sylvester's idea, also his arrangement, a thing she had accepted with more difficulty than she had accepted most things, and Mrs. Drumbar, who had taken the train up from the village and who sat in the back of the room, with her hands folded in her lap, and did not visibly react to anything, which was, Beatrix understood, her version of being moved. The record would show Beatrix Tolland, acknowledged daughter of the late Earl of Tolland, Ranald Tolland, by declaration of the 4th of December. It was not everything. It was not the house, which was Sylvester's, and would remain Sylvester's, and which she had made her peace with in the only way she knew how, which was to understand it as true, and stop expecting it to feel different than it did. It was not legitimacy in the legal sense that her father had not been able to give her. It was not a restored inheritance, or a corrected record, or anything that resembled the life she might have had in some different version of the story. But it was her name, in a register attached to his name, with the word daughter in between. She stood on the pavement outside the offices in Edinburgh, while Sylvester spoke to the solicitor, and she looked at the street, busy, cold, gray with December, and she felt something that she could not quite describe, except that it was slightly different from what she had felt every day for 2 years, which was the sensation of standing on ground that might or might not hold. This ground held. Sylvester came down the steps and stood beside her. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. Then, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The solicitor's bill is formidable." She looked at him. He was looking at the street, and there was something in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite something else, but somewhere between the two, that she had been learning to read over the last 3 months, slowly, in the way you learn to read a new landscape. "I should like," he said after a moment, "to ask you something. You're at liberty to tell me it's too soon, or that the answer is no, or that I've misunderstood the situation entirely." She waited. "I bought that house," he said, "because I wanted something real, something that stayed." He paused. "I've found, over the last several months, that what I was looking for was not entirely architectural." The street was very busy. Someone's horse had decided to be difficult about a cart. A woman with several parcels was negotiating the pavement with the focused determination of a general. "I'm listening," Beatrix said. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "not in the East Wing, not as a cataloger. I'd like you to stay as—" He stopped, started again, "as someone who is here because she wants to be, if that's something you'd want. I understand if it isn't." She had thought, in the abstract, that she knew what she would feel if something like this happened. She had been wrong about that, which was perhaps not surprising, because she had been wrong about a number of things over the last 3 months. What she felt was something very simple and quite solid, like a foundation that had been there all along, underneath the shifting surface of the last 2 years, and she had simply not been standing in the right place to feel it. "The East Wing chimney smokes," she said. "I know," he said. "I've had someone look at it. It's the damper." "I know about the damper," she said. "I fixed it." "I know you did." He looked at her. Beatrix. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked at the street for a moment longer. The horse had resolved its objection. The woman with the parcels had achieved the pavement. "Yes," she said. "All right." They were married in the spring, in the church in the village, which had seen 4 generations of Tollands married and buried, and was apparently willing to accommodate a 5th, however unconventionally arrived. Mrs. Drumbar wore a gray dress that was probably her best dress, and that she had clearly been wearing since approximately 1887. She cried, briefly and efficiently, during the ceremony, and then stopped and returned her expression to its normal setting, which was the expression of someone who had things to do. The South Garden roses were not yet in bloom. It was April, too early for the June roses. But the gardener, who had apparently taken the matter personally, had sourced some from a greenhouse in the county, and they were banked along the gate in a color that was not quite right for the season, but that was close enough. Beatrix stood in the church and felt the floor solid under her feet, and thought about what it meant to be, in a place not because you had nowhere else to go, but because you had chosen it and had been chosen by it, and the two things had settled into each other like the pages of a book that had finally been closed properly. The solicitor in Edinburgh, when he heard, sent a brief note of congratulations. He mentioned, in passing, that Harwick Crane had withdrawn all remaining inquiries. Sylvester read this at the breakfast table and looked up. "He's realized," Beatrix said, without looking up from her own letter, "that there's nothing left to contest." "Yes," Sylvester said. "He was never interested in the house," she said. "Not really. He was interested in the instability. He needed something to be uncertain. And now nothing is," Sylvester said. She looked at him across the table, in the morning light that came through the windows of the room that had been her father's breakfast room and his father's breakfast room, and that was now simply theirs. "No," she said, "nothing is. Outside, along the south wall, the roses that would not bloom until June were already growing.